So we've been spending the last number of weeks or months talking about the fruit of the Spirit. Do you think we can kind of tick them off? What are they? The fruit of the Spirit is love, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. Is there any others? I think good job.
We need the rest of the series, I guess.
We stopped at peace. The last one was peace. But, we don't need the series, obviously. We have the word. Isn't it so much easier to tick those off? Like if we actually said, are you love? Or is that fruit? Is that growing? Joy, peace? Do we struggle with this aspect of what does it mean for us to live in the experience of the fruit of the Spirit? Is it growing out of our lives? Is it really actually part of our experience? And if so, why is it that so often we're driven, compulsive, obsessive, anxious, angry, frustrated? What's the disconnect between the fruit of the Spirit and what our lived experience really is like? Unless it's just me, which I'm certain that it's not, I might have a worse case of it than some. But the fruit of the Spirit is a really cool idea. I like the idea. The idea of peace sounds really good. And yet, I have found at times, even just this past summer, a couple weeks ago on vacation, I could sit by a beautiful lake and feel unsettled. Have deep questions about, am I okay? And so how can this be? How can I sit by this tranquil lake having the opportunity, no responsibilities that are even pressing on me, and yet wrestling with, can I experience a sense of peace? Do I experience joy? Do you ever wonder if you'll have enough? Will you have what it takes? Will you measure up to the expectations of other people? Will you measure up to the demands that are pressing in on you? Will you have enough for retirement? Will you have enough for next week? Do you have enough for the catastrophe? The answers to those questions are almost always no. We don't. There's always something that could come up that would exhaust our resources no matter how much we have. There's always some catastrophic something that could undo us, that could threaten to take us out. And yet, the Bible talks very clearly about the fruit of the Spirit and our sense of living in that space. But it takes so little to unbalance us. Life feels so tenuous. I think I remember mentioning this the last time I spoke here a year or so ago. And then even before that at the men's retreat, I was telling a story of, about 2 years ago. I came home from work one day and my septic tank had collapsed in my backyard. That was a moment in time that unbalanced me. I was laying in bed in the preceding days, or in the post-season. I should know that. It's post-season. It's after it happened. I'm laying in bed, and I'm actually having thoughts like, this thing that just happened in my backyard is actually probably going to keep my kids from being able to go to college. It probably will ruin me completely. I probably will never retire. I literally remember laying awake, looking at the ceiling, having those kinds of thoughts running through my head. Do you know what I mean? You ever have that kind of it's ridiculous. We wake up in the morning and say, how could we be so stupid? How could we be so ignorant? How could we be so foolish to actually believe that something as simple as a septic tank caving in would actually lead to the demise of my family and my future and my quality of life? It's going to just be extinguished. And yet we do it all the time, don't we? We drive to work and somebody can cut us off on the road and it can ruin our day. It can take us out. The balance of our lives are so very tenuous, so fragile, so it doesn't take much to undo us, let alone something really significant. There are some big things that occur in life that really are significant and scary, and And those things take us out as well. But oftentimes, for the most part, we're undone just simply by the frivolous and by the stupid and by the stuff that doesn't matter at all. It's like, I'm mad because somebody didn't do something quite right. It's like how foolish I can be, how much I can be disconnected from the peace of God, how much I can be disconnected from joy, how much I can be disconnected from what God's doing. So let's turn to the Scripture and see what God might, how God might help us out a bit. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 11. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their own works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. So let's take a look at the setting and what the Hebrew writer is talking about, and kind of the beginning of the concept of Sabbath. So you might remember the story. Israel is in Egypt. They're enslaved. They're building the pyramids. They're building some of the great wonders of the world. They're being driven by slavery. I mean, it is oppressive. It is hard. There's an economic injustice that's going on. There's this uber sense in which production must occur. And if you're not producing, it's straight up and clear you're lazy. Like, how many of you have ever felt that if you're not producing, you're lazy? Like I remember just thinking that the other day. I was sitting on my patio, just enjoying the weather and thinking, you lazy butt. Don't you just see the siding really needs to be washed? Like, how dare you just sit there? And so we live in a culture and a world that's a lot like Egypt. Egypt in the Bible is always a reference and a symbol of just the world, of just what it means to live in the world. And the world is driven by production. It must produce. And if you don't, you are one rotten, lazy person. Like, you really ought to step it up. You really ought to get it in gear. Like, come on, let's go already. Produce. Pharaoh says this to the people of Israel. The people of Israel are under this great oppression. They're driven by slavery. Work. And they go to Pharaoh and they say, can we please have a break? Can we please go into the wilderness and worship our God? Please give us some rest. And what does Pharaoh say? You lazy butts. Like, actually, that's what he kind of said. He didn't use the butts part, but he said, you're lazy people. Like, if you have time to go into the wilderness to worship your God, you're not working hard enough. And so what he did is he took away his straw. And he said, you know what, we're not going to provide straw for you anymore because you obviously have plenty of time. You can go into the word, you can go worship. That means you can gather your own straw. So go get your straw. By all means, go get it and keep producing the same number of bricks. That'll settle you down. That'll shut you up. Now get to work. You're lazy. Let's go. And that's what Pharaoh does. That's what our world does. That's what we experience. Like, I experience it on my patio. It's like, come on, let's go, Tim. That siding needs to be washed. You could build something in the backyard that just would be fun. Like, just don't sit and do nothing. Don't rest. Don't go. And we're driven by that kind of anxiety. It's our world. It's Egypt. It's our experiences in life. We're driven. And Israel then cries out to God. They cry out in desperation. They say, God, we're undone. Like, we are done. Like, we can't manage this anymore. And so they cry out to God, and God does what God does. He hears them. He hears them. He hears the cries of his people. He hears them crying out, and he comes down and he sends Moses. He sends a rescuer. He sends someone to lead them out of this uber anxious culture that drives production, and says, I will come and I will take you out of that place. And I'm going to take you to, where did he take them? Where were they headed? What's the scripture say? Do you remember the term? Promised land. I'm going to take you out, and I'm going to take you to the promised land that is flowing with milk and honey. It's a word picture of, I'm going to take you to a place of rest. I'm going to take you to a place of plenty. I'm going to take you to a place where the anxieties of life aren't driving you, aren't calling you names, aren't beating you up. I'm going to take you out of that world, and I'm going to take you somewhere else. The challenge is that it was pretty easy for God to take Israel out of Egypt. What became much more difficult as we look at the history is it was really difficult for God to get Egypt out of Israel. Like it's a lot harder. Like it's the Exodus story is only like a book long. It's only a few chapters. It's like, okay, Moses or Pharaoh's going to resist God, and God's going to just beat him down and deliver his people because his people cried out. And it's not that hard. It's like, you want to fight me? Okay, well, let's tangle. And God wins. And he leads them out powerfully and masterfully. And they're in the wilderness. They're delivered. I mean, Egypt is decimated. And the people are gone. But you know what? Egypt was so much inside of Israel. There's so much there. It wasn't long until they're complaining and grumbling and saying, why don't we just go back to Egypt? We had plenty of food back there. It wasn't like there we can go and produce. Like, can we do that? And then God does something miraculous and spectacular. He gives them what we now call the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments aren't just a list of rules. The Corinthians talks about that the law of God, or that we should work hard to apprehend the spirit of the law. Like the letter of the law will just destroy us and it'll beat us down if we just see it as a list of rules. But the spirit of the Ten Commandments was this. It was to lead us into a place of non-anxious living, a place of freedom, a place free of oppression. And how? How does the Ten Commandments lead to that? The first 4 commandments are about how we worship God. Thou shalt have no other gods before you. Like your commitment to God is summed up in the first 4 commandments. The last 6 of the commandments, I should say then commandment number 5, the middle commandment is the Sabbath commandment. The last 5 commandments are about how you relate to other people. Don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't envy. Like these are all commandments that are telling you about how to live at peace with other people. How do you have a productive society? How about we not do all of these things? That would actually go a long way. That makes a culture a lot safer, a lot healthier. And so the Sabbath command is right there in this middle commandment. It links the two together, and it's the way to get Egypt out of Israel. It's the way to get our anxieties of our world out of us. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days will you labor and do your work. On the 7th day you will rest as a memorial to what God has done. Because God finished his work, and so we trust him and we stand down and we rest. And that rest prepares us to worship God, and it prepares us to interact with people. It helps us be good neighbors. It helps us think about how to relate to other people. It's the way in which we get Egypt out of us. So I like in Hebrews 4, it talks about this sense that we must make every effort to enter rest. What a paradox. Like effort sounds like work to me. Like, how about not? Like, do I have to? Like, I don't want to work. I'm tired of working. And yet the Hebrew writer makes it very clear. Make an effort. Like, what's the effort? How do we do that? Like, how do we go about that? You see, I want you just to think about the effort is about cultivation, not about production. Production is something that flows. It follows. Cultivation, if we think about, we live in a farming community. So if you think about cultivation of a crop, I think if we think about cultivation of the fruit of the Spirit, like cultivation is this sense that we are doing things to prepare the ground for things to grow, but we have absolutely no power in the production itself. And so to enter the rest of God isn't about us doing something and making it happen and producing it. It's about, can we learn how to cultivate? Can we prepare the ground so that we can enter what God is leading us to? Can we get Egypt out of us? And can we prepare the ground? And so as I think about what I hope that you take away from this morning will be some reflections about what would it mean for you to begin to cultivate differently, or to cultivate a significant something internally that will allow the Spirit of God to produce His fruit. Because God is the producer. God is the one that brings about a harvest. Like Paul talks about it, some plant, some water, but it's God that brings the increase. God is the one who produces. We're cultivators. We're creating the environment whereby we can thrive, whereby other people can thrive. And we want to cultivate, not produce. Disobedience is about trying to produce and earn what is to be cultivated. Like, how did Israel disobey? How do we disobey? It's not just by doing the wrong thing or breaking a commandment. That's just one very narrow element of disobedience. Disobedience is much better understood as a sense that we're trying to do one thing in order to get another, and we're doing it in a wrong and unhealthy way. And so when we try to produce the fruit of the Spirit, we're going to be living in disobedience. It's not going to accomplish what God has designed for it to accomplish. And so we want to move away from production and the disobedience of production and into cultivation and the place of rest and the place of obedience, because that's where we will experience a radically different way of living. So we're going to talk about some really practical aspects of this. This is kind of like philosophical and theological and deep. And I want to get really, really practical. How do we go about this? I remember when I was young, and I used to work in a hardware store, and I would always try to come up with a really glorified title that really didn't mean anything close to what I was actually doing. So I was an electric power tool technician. What I actually was, I just put switches in drills. But I was an electric power tool technician. And so later, as I was thinking about a sense of call to ministry and so forth, I was like, I want to be a specialist in applied sanctification. I was like, that sounds good. I think that's what I want to be, a specialist in applied sanctification. And so this morning, what I hope for the rest of this morning is to be an element of applied sanctification. So sanctification is that process of how we're made holy, how we become who God wants us to be. And can we find some really practical ways in which we can cultivate, in which we can be non-anxious people, in which we can enter rest, and can we find some practicalities in that? So anxiety is the protest of our soul against being left alone. So when you feel anxious, if we really boil down anxiety to its grit, it's really that I'm just afraid you're going to let me alone. Like, think about the babies in their cribs. You lay them down and they're sleeping peacefully, and you sneak out the door and you're barely out the door. Ah! What's the baby is protesting. The baby's protesting being left alone. There's an anxiety about being left alone. We can even press that even deeper, is that anxiety is really about our fear of dying. It's a sense that we're not going to have enough. Like, we perish in disobedience. Like, there's a sense in which one master therapist said really everybody that comes to counseling is coming to wrestle with their fear of death. That's the ultimate fear. It's the sense that I'm finite, and I might not matter. And so I got to wrestle with this very, very deep fears. And anxiety is this experience of that I'm afraid. I'm afraid of being left alone. Sabbath rest is its antidote. Learning how to rest, move away from production and into cultivation, is where we begin to find and experience the peace of God. It ties together our relationship with God. It ties together our relationship with other people, and it allows us to be at peace with ourselves. And so Sabbath rest is the antidote. We're going to talk about that in three primary ways in which we deal with our anxieties. And so for those of you that I suspect there's a couple people here in a crowd this size that is saying, anxiety, I don't struggle with anxiety. That's just the weak-minded people. That's just the people who don't, they're really, when you hear about people feeling like fidgety and sweaty palms or heart racing or laying on the bed and looking at the ceiling. I mean, you lay down in bed and you're asleep in 2 minutes and you're waking up like a spring chicken when the alarm goes off and you're ready to go. And you don't know anxiety at all, and you're like, I don't know what anxiety is. I want to encourage those of you that might be having that experience to listen to what I'm saying as it relates to anxiety and just change the word anxiety and put in anger. Because everything I say about managing anxiety this morning is applicable to how we deal with our agitation and with our anger. And my hunch would be is that for those of you that are not experiencing much anxiety, I bet the people around you might experience your anger or your temper or your agitation or your sense of like, how can people just be so dumb? Like, and you're frustrated with people. And you're going to find that your anger is a lot like anxiety. It functions in much the same way. In many regards, anger is like a secondary emotion oftentimes that sits on top and protects us from having to deal with our anxieties, and so we just get angry. Rather than dealing with my fears, I'll just call you a buffoon. Like, you're just crazy. And so that protects me from having to deal with me if I can just be angry at you because you're so dumb. And so that's how anger tends to function, is we tend to project out on other people that they're missing it. And so if you find that anxiety isn't your thing, I encourage you to think in terms of how you manage anger. So Stanley Hibson has a great little book called Anxiety Gone, where he talks about the 3 C's of anxiety that I'm going to share with you this morning. It's calming our body is step 1. Then it's correcting our thinking. And then confronting our fears. So anxiety, it hijacks our body. Like, it takes over. Like, there's a sense in which anxiety keeps us awake because it's taken over our physical, cellular, neurological processes. It's like I don't care how much you tell me not to think about it. I'm going to sit there and think about it. I'm going to lay there and it's going to run through my head and I can't stop it. For God's sake, I pray, I do all this, that, and it's there and I can't get it out of my mind. It's like it hijacks the system. Our body gets overwhelmed. Our thinking gets corrupted and distorted. And so it's like I'll have these catastrophic ideas and the whole world's going to fall down on top of me. And then our fears paralyze us and they keep us locked into places that we cannot change. So let's take a look at calming our body. So our bodies are miraculous in power. Like the psalmist talks about, like, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. Our body is a spectacular creation. Like, it's designed for regulating our life experience. Like, everything that we do through our body. Like, our body is involved in the entirety of our lives. Like, we don't experience hardly anything outside it and that doesn't have an impact on our body, or that our body's not in cooperation or in participation with it. We're fearfully and wonderfully made. And so anxiety and anger and sadness and emotion are designed by God and are gifts from God that help us stay regulated. It helps us as like a barometer, a thermometer. It tells us the temperature. It tells us the pressure. It tells us that things are okay or not okay. It teaches us to run from the pit bull that's chasing us. It helps us to make good decisions. It helps us to prepare for what needs to happen. And so all of these things are good things. It's just that anxiety can hijack us and take over our body. And Jesus says this in Mark. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." We need rest. Our bodies need time to calm. We need to teach our bodies how to settle down, how to sit still. We need to learn muscle control. We need to learn how to control our breathing. We need to understand how our bodies function, because our bodies are so critical in how we experience life. There are several things that keep us from being able to have control of our body. And one of those is the experience of trauma. When we're traumatized, whether it's from abuse, whether it's from a car accident, whether it's from a scary experience, trauma can hijack our brain. It can hijack our body by leading to our bodies to respond to things without us even having any sense of control over it. A few years ago, and I asked my daughter if I could tell this story. A few years ago, probably about 8 years ago, I'm guessing, she probably was about, I don't know, maybe 7, 8 years old. We were at Hocking Hills, and we were hiking between Ash Cave and Cedar Falls. How many of you have ever made that hike? It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And we were like at the halfway point between that, and we just had a bunch of small kids with us, and so we're kind of taking our time, and we start to hear the rumble of thunder in the distance. And we pick up our pace a little bit, and we decide, do we go back to Ash Cave, or do we kind of pick up speed and get to Cedar Falls where our vehicles were going to be at? What do we do? And so we decided to forge ahead, and this massive storm rolled in. It was terrifying. We were running through torrential rains, electrical storm, lightning striking trees. Where like some of my nephews saw a fireball flying out of the tree right down. We could feel the tingle of the. It's like, and it was terrifying. And we were running. The kids were crying, and we were wanting to get up to shelter. Absolutely terrifying. 3 years, 4 years later, we would be in bed, and I would hear a rumble of thunder. And I would lean over and I would make a bed on the floor because I know my daughter's coming. Like it was a gimme. Like as soon as thunder rolled, she was terrified, absolutely, like almost inconsolably terrified. There was no, hey, it's okay, go back to bed. No, her body was hijacked. It's like the neurological systems are flooded. It's like trauma has a way of impacting us. And it takes over the system, and we can't do anything about it. Like our bodies are out of control. It's like we're terrified, and our bodies are responding to things that aren't dangerous as though they are. So we're in our house, and it's a simple thunderstorm. She's not in danger, actually, but she feels like she's going to die. It's like this is terrible. And so trauma has a way of doing that in our lives. If it's a particular person that abused us, our bodies will be telling us, be careful. We'll be hyper aroused around that person because we're scared. Our bodies are going to be doing that kind of work. And so so trauma can take over our bodies and create lots of anxiety in our lives. Then bad habits are a way in which our bodies get out of control. So like, how many of you know that an oatmeal cream pie can do wonders for you? Or that piece of chocolate, like Grater's ice cream dark chocolate. Like how many of you know that if you're not feeling really well, like that really helps. It's like black raspberry chip waffle cone. Like that would really solve my problem. Like I would feel better. And so if we repeat things over and over, we can build some really, really bad habits. Food, drink, alcohol, drugs, porn, sex, anger, spending. All of these things have addictive kind of qualities. They take over our body. They take over and we lose a sense of control. And so our challenge will be, can we learn to calm the body? One other way in which our body can kind of begin to lose control, or it gets rattled, is when we just repress our emotion. Like many of us have grown up with this lesson that emotions are dangerous, very dangerous. Like don't feel, don't express your feelings, don't deal with them because it's just not cool. Like it doesn't represent what it means to be a good Christian. You know what? Good Christians don't get angry, do they? Like you shouldn't feel what you feel. And so many of us are taught explicitly or implicitly, like just shut it down. Don't feel. So here are some practical tips about how we can deal with our body. Adequate sleep. It's a foundational aspect of our bodies being able to do well is being able to sleep. It's a spiritual discipline. It's important. Even Jesus took naps. Naps are a wonderful gift from God. Like laying down and taking a nap is a wonderful thing to do. It's a kingdom activity. Like Jesus did it. Like we see it in the Bible. Like if we say we follow Jesus, we probably ought to take a nap once in a while. I'm not even joking. It's funny, but I'm serious. But what will happen if you take a nap? We won't produce. And who takes naps? Lazy people take naps. Lazy people take a nap. It's like that's the internal process. And so Jesus was one of the laziest, unproductive people. Jesus taught us to take a nap. He taught us to sleep. He taught, it's important for us to calm our body. Breathing is an important aspect of staying alive and being able to function. It's really critical. I remember one time helping a person who had a severe anxiety disorder. And they weren't able to stand in line and order their coffee because of the panic that would ensue. And we were talking, and as we're talking about it, I'm watching him. And as we're talking, and I looked at him and I said, how about you try breathing? Don't hold your breath. Even as we're talking about it, he's there. And I can see his anxiety beginning to grow. And I said, why don't you try breathing? Let's take a deep breath together. Into the nose, out through the mouth, letting your stomach do the work rather than your chest. And your anxieties will come down exponentially. 1 week later, a person who had not stood in line to order his coffee or would avoid the TSA lines or would refuse to get in a line because of panic attacks. 1 week later, he said, Tim, I stood for 10 minutes in the line at Starbucks and got my coffee. And all I did was focused on my breathing. What happened? He calmed his body. When we calm our body, our brains can work. When our body is all jazzed up, we can't think. We can't our cognitive abilities go out the window. Learn to breathe. It's in Genesis. God breathed into us the breath of life. If we want to live, it would be a good idea to just breathe. And I may ought to write a song. No, somebody already did. Just breathe. It's breathe. It really is important. Muscle relaxation. The Mental Health Board is giving these out at the fair, these cool little squishy things. Why? Why would they give these out? Because they know that if a person is grounded and exercising their muscles, they're going to have a sense of control of their body. It's you can squeeze it. Some people get annoying and they just click their pen. And it's what's happening when they're doing that? It's a way of trying to stay grounded. And so when we use our muscular system, we can tighten it up, and we can feel tension, and we can release tension. We can tighten up, we can lose. We can go through our whole body and tense our muscles and release. And we begin to learn that we have some control of our body. We can calm it. Nutrition and exercise. Are you eating well? If you want to cultivate, good food is really important. What you feed yourself is good. Staying grounded. Medications can oftentimes be really helpful. Sometimes our systems get so messed up over such a long period of time, and we live in a broken world, that our biological system simply isn't functioning as it should. And medications can at times be really, really helpful for controlling our body. So let's move to the next one, correcting your thinking. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9 says this, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Our distorted thoughts lead us directly into anxiety and into anger and into depression. You know what? I hope it's none of you, but there is somebody, a couple people, that, man, when they're on their way to Dublin, I don't like them. They drive like crazy people. And they'll cut me off. And it ticks me off, and I don't like it. And I think then, like, maybe that's why the engineers at Ford put a turbo on the car, so I can catch up to them and make sure they don't do it again. Because if I cut them off, maybe they will learn their lesson. No, I actually don't do that. I don't do that. But, well, sometimes I wouldn't say I've never like helped a person learn not to do that by making sure they can't get in front of me. I should confess, I've done that. But our distorted thoughts lead us into that kind of anxiety, that kind of behavior, that kind of process, that kind of anger, that kind of angst. It's like, I think you owe it to me. Like, and it's my responsibility as a productive citizen and someone who cares about just the safety of the population for me to make sure I keep you from hurting people. And so it's actually my obligation. And so my way of thinking, that's a distorted way of thinking. How many of you ever thought those kind of thoughts? He needs to learn a lesson. And then we become God's anointed and God's the person who should be the one teaching the lesson. We might be right on. They need to learn a lesson. But we tend to then confuse that with it's my responsibility to teach it. Well, no, it's not. That's the distortion. It's like just because somebody needs to learn a lesson doesn't mean it's yours to teach it. And so the way we think drives our anxieties, and it drives our anger, and it drives our depression. It's like we think out of bounds. Sometimes people call it stinking thinking. It's like we think that are ways that are not right. We tend to think in all or nothing categories. Like it's all this or it's all that. Think in terms of like one of the questions that people ask that is so unproductive is like, are you a racist or not? Like that's a terrible question. Like, so there's like only those categories? Like it's either you are or you're not? It's like, what about if we would ask more along the questions about, like, do we tend to make judgments about people who are different than us? And how often do we do so? It's like, now we're starting to get to a much more productive kind of question. Now I can start to say, well, I don't know if I fit in the category or not, but I know that I have the propensity to make judgments about other people when they look different than I do. I know that I might make a judgment about somebody if they are in a different class than I'm in. I might make judgments about people who seem to be really, really poor, and I'll make judgments about them. Or I will make judgments about the uber rich. Because it's like, we don't want to function in just black and white categories. That leads us into distortions. It leads us into anxiety and anger and frustration. And so we need to learn how to move away from our categorical thinking. How many of you, like, if you just ask now, our current climate is like, if you're Democrat or Republican, like that tells me everything I need to know about you. Like, I don't even think I can be your friend. Like you probably if you're different than me, you don't even have a single good idea. In fact, you're nuts. Like, you're just crazy. And I can't even be your friend. It's like, that's what categorical thinking does to us. And what happens if we treat people in categories? We actually begin to create the very reality we fear. We begin to create the very things that we want to move away from. We mind read people. We use emotional reasoning. Like, rather than thinking things through, we'll just, I feel it, so that must be true. Like, I feel like you don't like me, so that must mean you don't like me, so nobody likes me. It's like, well, no, it's distortion. We filter things through the negative. 14 positive things happen, one negative thing happens, and the world's coming to an end, and we're just like it only takes one thing to upset the apple cart, and 30 positive things occurred, and I don't even count them. Or we catastrophize, and it's my septic tank fell in, and my kids won't ever go to college. Like, it's that easy, it's clear. So do you see the connection between your anxiety and your thinking? Do you see personally, can you look at your own life and be reflective and say, yeah, I see how my way of thinking impacts what I feel, my anxiety. I can see how my way of thinking impacts my anger. And I can take responsibility for me. I can take responsibility for what's happening internally for me. So what can you do? Practical. You guys are going to love this. It's so simple. It's so easy. What do? Journal. right. Come on, you're supposed to show a little more excitement than that. Like, man, you got an opportunity to take what's in your heart and put it out in words. Like, what a wonderful opportunity. What a gift, actually, that we actually can take what's inside and we can get it out. And we can examine it. We can think it through. We can process it. We can be reflective. It's a gift that God has given us to cultivate. But we don't. It's not productive enough. It doesn't just fix it automatically. It's like it sets the ground, but it doesn't quite scratch the itch. It's like, seriously, isn't that like just stewing in my slime? It's like, no. Journaling and writing about what we think and what we feel and how it impacts us, research shows us it helps tremendously. It can help correct our way of thinking. Pray. Not just pray, God, take this away, but will we listen to God and let him speak to what's happening internally? Can we listen and hear him? Can we talk with him about our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, what's happening internally, and be reflective with God? Tell your story to other people. Find people that are safe that you can talk to. Talk about what you're thinking, what you're feeling. I know when I talk to a friend and say, you know what, I'm really feeling overwhelmed. I really feel like, man, my world's going to come apart. My kids won't go to college, blah, blah, blah. He'll look at me and be like, seriously? Like you believe that? I'm like, no, that's kind of dumb. No, you're right. So when we tell our story and other people can hear us and they can look at us and say, you know what, that sounds like a distortion to me. Is there another way of thinking? And we can have community. We can open up with one another, and people can speak into our lives. Tell your story, open up, and talk. The last one is confront your fears. Our fears paralyze us. They lock us into our dysfunction. Like the deepest levels of anxiety and anger and those kind of processes, we get locked into them because of our fears. If we want to get rid of anxiety, we need to confront the things that we're afraid of. What does that mean if you have a fear of spiders? I don't want to think about it. Like, what happens if you have a fear of snakes, a fear of flying? What happens if you have a fear of getting in a line and ordering your coffee? You got to go get in line and order your coffee and learn how to go order your coffee. And if you don't, you'll never order your coffee. It's like there's an element around which we must move into our fears, not away from them. It is for the joy that was set before him that Jesus endured the cross. He moved directly into the very thing that he feared. He was crying out to God, take this cup from me, let it pass. No. And he steadfastly marched straight into the cross. He walked right into what he feared. And we must do the same if we want to overcome our fears. Therefore, I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear, Jesus said. Like, will we give up worry? Worry is lots of memes you can find, but one is it's a little bit like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do and doesn't get you anywhere. It's like it just produces and produces. Nothing happens from it. It's completely unproductive. It's completely helpless. It doesn't do a thing for you, and yet we just do it. And our fears keep us stuck, and we just grind and grind and grind away. My friend Tim Clark died about 4 years ago from a brain tumor. And I remember right after he was diagnosed, and he called me, and I met with him at the hospital. And I walked in, and he looked at me, and he said, and at first I thought he was questioning his faith. But he looked at me and he said, Tim, is God reliable? And what I learned in the coming year, as I walked with him through his until he died, was he wasn't asking that question in terms of doubt. He was expressing what we fear. He was expressing that question of, is God reliable for me? Like, we ask that question very, very deeply and very, very often. Is he reliable? As I watched his life, he answered it as a resounding yes. But he was willing to grapple with that question. What do you fear? What are they? Do you know? Can you access them? I tend to fear disapproval, rejection, being seen as a fraud. Like, I remember when I started my doctoral program, they talked about, they said, all of you are probably here thinking you're the one person who really just kind of squeak through the system, and you really shouldn't be here because you don't have what it takes. I'm like, yeah, that's me. Yeah, I might be seen as a fraud. Someday, I got to my dissertation, I'm just about finished, and I'm like, shoot, they're going to find out yet that I don't quite have what it takes to get across that. But I do. I did. It's like, often we do, and it's like our fears are almost always unrealistic and overblown, and they really don't, they just get in our way, and there's not substance to them. What do you fear? Can you put words to it? Are you willing to even look at it? Like, are you willing to say, I am not experiencing peace. I'm not experiencing rest because of what I fear and because of what I believe, and I am willing to look at it. That's a really scary process. I encourage you to, because research shows us that worry is deceitful. Psychology Today just recently published a research article that was studying people with generalized anxiety disorder. 91% of the worries that people had in this study never came to pass. 91%. So like if you could silence 91% of your anxieties and said, you know what, 90% of what you're worried about isn't going to happen. It's not even going to come close to true. It's not going to happen. Would that reduce anything for you? Like, do you not think you would have more capacity for the 9%? Like oftentimes we're just overwhelmed. Like we have thresholds. It's like I can take some stress. Like I can manage the 10% that might come true. Like life is hard. We're going to run into hard stuff. I can handle that. It's the 91% that's taking me out, and it's never going to happen. And research shows it. Of the 9% of things that did come to pass, 30% of that, the outcome was a whole lot better than what they would have expected. So now we even take the little bit that does come true, and we tend to catastrophize it and make it greater than what it really is, and it's really not as bad as we thought it was going to be. And what is as bad is we have each other, we have people, we have God. We can get through some tough times. You're strong people. Like we're resilient people. We can take a couple hits in life and get back up. It's that we can't take the 91% of the hits that never will come. We can't handle life with all of those hits. That would take us out. But it won't. It's not going to happen. That's not the way life works. So what's the practicals? Turn to your fears and face them. Expose yourself to them. Move courageously towards them. Explore what you believe. Look at them. Take action. Read, learn, listen, experience. And then I want us to remember and remind ourselves of what does God say. And worship team, you can come on forward. I was initially planning to transition to a time of communion, which isn't scheduled after all, but I was thinking that it was. And I had this wonderful ending that was just going to be so moving and so powerful to tie into communion, and then I find out, no. And I'm like, see, it's all waste. Like everything I prepared is meaningless and it's worthless. And I just, no. So think about with me, if we were going to take communion, what communion represents is that we must remember, if we're going to confront our fears, we must remember what has occurred, and we must remind ourselves of it. That Jesus ultimately is the one that invites us into Sabbath rest and makes the way possible. He is the one who finished and completed the work. There's work that needed to be done, and Jesus did it. And we're invited to join in that rest. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God, that we can enter His rest. There is rest for our soul. Cultivate it. Learn it. Make every effort to enter His rest. Let's pray. Lord, thanks for your promise to never leave us, to never forsake us, that you promise to walk with us through the conflict and chaos of our lives. Just pray that you would give us courage. In Jesus' name, amen.